world today, I'm sure all of us, that's all we hear about is artificial intelligence. It's a huge issue. And I know that a lot of states are trying to figure out how to work through this thing. The federal government's looking at ways to do that. We've got some folks here that are some of the most brilliant people, and I say that because I sit and listen to them, and every time I walk away thinking, wow, these are really bright people. So we've got a group here. They've actually been convening. We've got a couple different working groups that are going on right now, one around workforce, one around policy with AI. We're looking deep into data privacy. So there's a number of things that we're working on right now. But the reason that this is here is that we want to get the public more engaged. We want to have more of that interaction, bring the public along with something like this. And we want your feedback. And that's part of the idea at the end of this. We're going to give an opportunity for question and answer. And then afterward, we'll even have an opportunity for you to be able to submit questions and set things. I did want to highlight just a few of the folks that help us get this going. These are some of the people that are involved in this. We're so grateful to connect with here as well as a number of these others. Have been helpful in just saying, hey, let's start to get more of these discussions going. So they've been a big partner, each of these groups has. We've gone through the Policy Innovation Lab. So we're on a show. I did want to add, the Policy Lab itself does actually have a board. We just wanted to get a group of people together to say, what are the topics we should be discussing? And so we wanted to make sure that the bipartisan, both House, Senate, executive branch, and our judicial branch. So these are the folks that have been helping kind of guide the direction. What are the topics we should be discussing? And so we're grateful for them in helping out. So this is a panel. We'll put these up here, and then Nick is actually going to give us a nice little presentation. For those that don't have this experience around what is this generative AI, Nick's going to give us a good little tutorial, and then we're going to jump into questions. And we're hoping to keep the questions fairly sustained. But we're going to talk about some of the opportunities. We'll talk about some of the risks we're seeing, and then some of the ideas that are already being discussed around where should we go as a state in terms of what should we be thinking about if we're looking at policy in this space.
I'm just going to be going through a quick AI overview for everyone here, with apologies if anyone online or here is an extremely experienced AI practitioner. This is going to be from a very high level view, possibly oversimplified. So just take that with the grain of salt it is. So what is AI? At its core, AI is machines synthesizing information and presenting it at a level that's either equivalent to or better than a human. And I'll start off that by saying, first, beware the hype cycle on that. I've been in data science for about 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years. This is, I think, the second or third hype cycle that I've seen around AI. So it comes and goes quite a bit. Right now, we're at obviously the apex of yet another hype cycle where people are saying everything from your rules-based engine is AI to, people are saying that we're a couple months away from Skynet and Terminator and Arnold Schwarzenegger. So be very cautious. Take everything you hear on AI with a grain of salt. So why is AI suddenly in the news? And a lot of that comes down to this rise of generative AI. What generative AI is AI that generates content. And this is not really a new technology at its core. Generative AI has been powering things like Google Translate since about 2016. I mean, this is not fundamentally new, but what's changed is the quality. So with the rise of ChatGPT, we're seeing generative AI that is convincingly human. And that's why it's in the news. That's why you can't go 10 minutes without seeing a ChatGPT story. And what companies are in this space? Right now, we're seeing pretty much everybody. Big tech, obviously, all the major tech players are doing something in the generative AI space. And then startups as well. We're seeing a lot of startup activity around this space. In just Q1 of 2023, I think it was on the slide, I think. Yeah, $1.6 billion was invested in just Q1 of this year in AI startups. So what can generative AI do? Broadly, you can kind of arrange it into three categories. Number one, the one that everyone knows from ChatGPT is generating text. That's models like ChatGPT. Google has released one called Bard. The next big thing they can do, generate images. Stable Diffusion and Midjourney are the two big players in this space, but it's enter text, get any image you want. And then finally, generate music or generate sound. That's an evolving space, but that's something where we're seeing a lot of growth. Google, I believe just a few months ago, released a model where you can input a description, something like, I want to hear the Nutcracker Suite played by a heavy metal band, and you can it'll actually put out something pretty close to what that would be. At its core, all these generative AI models they're just statistical models. The way they work, and this again, gross oversimplification, the way all of these models work is they're just trying to predict what's next. The easiest way to think about this is with text models, something like ChatGPT. If you prompt it with finish the sentence, I like to eat, it'll return something like I like to eat ice cream. And the way they train these models, the way these models are built is by giving them fragments of text and training them to come up with the best next word. And where we're seeing this growth, why we're seeing ChatGPT get so good all of a sudden is just this power is coming from size. Previous models were relatively small, but ChatGPT and the new generative models have really broken the mold. It's hard to understate how huge these are. Currently, the model underlying the open version of ChatGPT, a model called GPT 3.5, has 175 billion parameters. So imagine going back to high school algebra, imagine an equation with 175 billion terms. And GPT-4, the next generation of this, has 1 trillion parameters. These models, just the math, not the data underlying it, just the math of these models takes hundreds of gigabytes to store. The training data too, the size of the training data has really kind of pushed this quantum leap. These companies have collected, usually from the open source and from proprietary methods, hundreds of gigabytes of training text that they're using to train these models. So ChatGPT, about 570 gigabytes. And then advances in computation power and efficiency have pushed these as well. A lot of these companies are moving from your standard computers to custom-built supercomputers to train these models. These companies are all using human feedback to train these models. And what you're also seeing is just advances in how that human feedback is used, how efficiently it's used, how well it's used. And then also these companies, because they understand the implications, or they're afraid of the implications of the technology, they've built rules engines on top of these models as well. So most of us, I think, have played around with ChatGPT. You put something in ChatGPT like, how do I hack it in the Pentagon? You'll get this lawyerly answer of, please don't do that. That's usually that's not the model responding. That's a rules engine on top of it saying, please don't do that.
Thank you, Nick. Well, I hope that was helpful. For those of you that are new, some of you are probably, versed in this, but we want to make sure at least there was a level set. Well, let's get into now kind of the exciting part. We keep hearing all these cool things that AI can do. We're going to focus on some of the positives right now, but I want it to be open discussion. I know some panels you have it kind of selectively of who gets to pick. We just want to make this more of a casual conversation. So I'm going to start just kicking it off from each of your perspectives. And if you don't want to answer, that's fine too. But what are the biggest opportunities we see? What are things that we could see that's going to improve the world, make things better? What are all of you seeing in that space?
Maybe I'll jump in with a small example. In the world of tech support, for example, and let me say tech support and then coding is 2 separate things. For tech support, the classic flow is that the user has a problem, enters some sort of ticket, a service request or something, and then a help desk agent picks that up and does something with it, right? Well, what if a chatbot can be trained to do something with it just as well as a human, right? Or answer someone's question really intelligently. I don't know, that seems like kind of a small thing, but when you go across almost all the help desks out there, start thinking about how that could impact it. There could be a big impact there. With regard to coding and development, these generative AI models are extremely effective at coding. And if I can just share one quick example, I like to code in R. It's a language used by data scientists, and I come from a business intelligence background. So I just gave it a question: how can I download financial data from Yahoo Finance using R? Just with that simple prompt, it kicks out, here's the libraries you need, here's some sample code, gave me text to do it. And I've used that code and it's right. And so I was kind of impressed. But then I was like, can we do this in Python? Sure. And here it is translated to Python. And I was like, wow, that was pretty good. You just translated from one computer language to another in, seconds. And so, of course, now I'm having fun. So I'm like, can you do this in Fortran? Can we do this in COBOL? Can we do this in PL/SQL? Can we do this in Java? And the answer is yes, 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 and yes. And just with those simple language prompts, converting that, converting the simple set of code to all these different languages. And so they say, I've heard this thing that, AI is not going to replace doctors, but doctors who use AI are going to replace doctors who don't use AI. And I think you will certainly see that. My expectation is that you'll see that in the technology space with people who code, because this is like a superpower for a coder if they can use this to code a lot faster.
Just to tag on to Alan's comment about the chatbot, one thing that we've explored with some of our clients is almost imagine, and these are mostly e-commerce companies, but imagine a chatbot as almost a dedicated personal shopper. Same thing, you can use a chatbot to personalize, especially these chatbots that are very human seeming. You can use that chatbot to personalize the customer experience to a point that it's indistinguishable for the person, whether or not there's a human talking to them or it's a robot. And that could actually, for businesses, that can be a huge boon because that can increase customer engagement by orders of magnitude.
I'll use a term that I've read or thought about. It's called learning equity. And so the ability to raise the opportunity for people to learn at a faster, better level that might not have had access to that or have unique ways that they learn. So I'll give you an example in the classroom. I read in my classes every semester. And the reason that I do that is no matter how much time I spend trying to explain some things, I get students to say, I don't get it. And I'm like, I made a video for you. I wrote down step by step. I provided links to articles. I don't know how else. I don't tell them this, but I think this. And so with ChatGPT, I do something similar to the coding side, and I'll say, I just started doing this, by the way. And so I'll say, I want you to take this assignment, and I want you to design it in these 4 different learning styles. And so when I'm starting to launch my students is choose your own adventure. Here's the assignment in 4 different ways that you can learn it. And you can pick, and whichever one you want to do, you can turn in. And so things like that, things like with my 12-year-old who has some challenges with math, and to be clear, I have the same challenges with 12-year-old math. So it's not just on her. I've taught her, spent time with her, and she's getting better at it, how to create a tutor that she can interact with that will explain things to her in new ways in real time.
So just building on the learning aspect, I think if the ability to use these LLMs, the ChatGPTs of the world, really becomes democratized, then I think we have this massive decrease in the asymmetry of information. And so you actually have a situation where expertise becomes much less valuable, potentially. And so you think about just what happened when the internet sort of came to be. I'm old enough to remember that. And WebMD was a thing. And there was a little bit of anxiety, a lot of anxiety amongst doctors and other healthcare professionals that was going to somehow disrupt their ability to diagnose. And of course, that's partly true. I mean, all of us will go and now Google. Well, now with these kinds of tools, that potential is so much greater. And so the ability to really disrupt that asymmetry, I think, is huge.
I'm going to approach this from, I think, big picture Utah culture perspective of a small government. I see the opportunity of you can use AI to really align with the culture. We can have great government services that provide accessibility, but we don't have to fund it to the level of having hundreds of staff doing specific functions. In privacy, we actually have a scenario right now where we've identified about 30,000 collection forms. We have to essentially inventory forms and make sure every form gives notice to people of how we collect their personal information. And it's a big project. If you're going to go through and track these and update every single form, you could have hundreds of staff doing this. But if you train an AI model, you can approach the legislature and say, hey, we need to inventory these forms. We need some very skilled staff, 5 or 6 very skilled attorneys, and then an AI model And so not only can we provide a great service that provides transparency, but it's small government. It's fewer staff and people still get the great government service.
Delivering government services, we're in that business. And absolutely, we do so much sort of processing registrations, processing applications and registrations. And a lot of it's very rote, easily can be done with AI.
Going back to the efficiencies and the asymmetry of information, I think access to justice is going to be a big thing because AI is going to provide legal advice, very accessible in very accessible terms. And so, I think the legal profession is going to change and pivot, but I think this is a good thing to provide ease of access to justice and forms and all that sort of stuff. From a policy perspective, though, what AI can do in creating, and I'm going to tee up Barclay here, so in creating data sets, synthetic data to help us with policy decisions. So
areas that we're working on that are really exciting are in healthcare and education. So I'll give you an example of a study that recently came out from the University of Houston in a cancer setting. Right, so part of the challenge when you have patients is that if you treat all cancer patients the same, they're not, right? Each cancer patient has a different set of circumstances, different genetic makeup. So they're using generative algorithms now to go in and look at each individual patient, and they're able to have a much more precise precision medicine approach to each patient in terms of their treatment, what types of drug routines they're providing, right? So these generative algorithms are providing this opportunity. One of my partners, he did a big study with the national health system in Europe, where in Utah, we face this problem with suicide and self-harm is a big issue. And so they went across and scraped a whole bunch of data in the NHS, and they are able with these generative algorithms to start predicting self-harm rates and so now the physicians are able to anticipate who's going to engage in self-harm, and they intervene in a much more precise, caring way, right? And I'll just give you one more example in education, because I think there's the content side of education, but the other side is the data analytics. We just ran a study around reading, and the level of which you can anticipate where a child is going in reading is getting really robust with these data sets. And so all of a sudden you can take and you do the assessment, right? You know where these students are. You can create this great rich content, and now you have these assessments that are based on these generative predictive algorithms, and you match the instruction with the student in the assessment, and then that just takes it up to a whole different level. So that promise on the data side, I think, is really, really exciting.
I'm glad that we talked about health. When I think of benefits of AI, I immediately think of what are our largest problems? What are the things that trouble us most day to day? On a geopolitical standpoint, what are the things that the nation is facing? And this health is definitely going to be part of that. We're going to have, some people are predicting cures to cancer in the next 5 to 10 years using AI to help solve different forms of disease. And I think cancer is definitely going to be on the list. I also think from a geopolitical standpoint, this may be our saving grace. Our reserve currency is facing a lot of challenges right now. And we're all seeing that. We just had a debt ceiling raise this week. And a lot of people are saying, well, we're just kicking the can down the road. And there are a lot of people in my space that are saying, well, maybe AI is actually going to be our saving grace around this. And maybe we'll get so much GDP out of production, out of this tool, that we could actually not just, whether we save the currency or not, may be irrelevant, but it will create more GDP, no question. And then, let me bring up some other discussions about job displacement and things like that. Yeah. But I think there's massive benefits, and it's really what are the things that trouble you the most? I think AI actually will step in on some level.
So I think I might have shared this with some of you, but I listened to a lecture from a Harvard Business School professor about AI, and he was giving this example of how Barclays Bank, not your bank, but Barclays Bank in London had implemented a whole lot of new technology to be able to increase productivity per worker. And so productivity per worker was sort of between It was at like $400,000 and it went to like $800,000. So it was this huge ROI for that technology deployment. But then he compared that with a bank in China that was really using AI smartly. And that productivity per worker went from 1 to 16 million, which is just mind-boggling that it could be that extreme. And so then again, you go to displacement and you go to labor to capital ratios and those kinds of things that can be very disruptive. But I just find that scale really amazing.
Well, if there's anything else, we'll shift to some of these because I think that tees up. And you know, I hear a lot of my constituents as a legislator, some of the concerns, right? We talk about is my data safe, right? I want to know, you know, is my identity being used? We talk about deepfakes. There's all these things that people are hearing in the public. And so I wanted to just hit on that. So from your perspectives, and you all come from different backgrounds, but what are some of the risks that we're seeing? And then I think we'll follow that up afterwards. Some of the things we're thinking about generally of ways that we can address some of these risks. But we'll start with risks. What are you seeing? What are some of the concerns we have out there right now?
I'll take the lead on this with the privacy risk. Those are pretty obvious in that we have to account how do you manage privacy within AI? AI in the models may have lots of personal information. You may prompt it. You may enter data into that. AI can use to make decisions and determinations about individuals. There are huge implications that you have to account for. In Utah and at the federal level, we have no comprehensive privacy act. We have very disparate and segmented laws. In Utah, we have dozens of laws that may impact AI for government entities, how we use it, how we process data. And then we have the Utah Consumer Privacy Act that we know there's a threshold on that of companies that are governed by it. So if you're a small company, but you start using AI and it has a model that has hundreds of thousands of people's data in it, but you're a small startup, how do you do privacy in that? So we're really considering, we don't have the whole strategy yet, but how do we incorporate privacy into our laws to ensure users and the Utahns are protected? Specifically, I'll call out notice. How do you get notice of how your data is going to be used in AI? There's a concept, and we don't have the answer for this, about how do you untrain an AI model? I was talking with our chief strategy officer the other day, and if you put PII into it, you request your data to be deleted. How do you get that out? It's a complex question. It would change, how do you have to build AI? So right now, you don't want to stop the industry from growing, but we need to figure out what are those guardrails, the rules that companies have to play by, so that we can then have AI companies here in Utah while still protecting personal information.
Well, maybe quickly, there's an article on KSL this week, kind of referring back to Senator Cullimore's comments. I do think it's going to really change the law profession, but then we have an example of a law professor, a lawyer who showed up in court with a brief, and unfortunately, the brief had a lot of citations that were completely false. And, these, of course, very embarrassing for the lawyer. What do you think about that in sort of a broader sense? It's like, well, you look at Google Bard and it puts right on there, don't use this model for legal, financial, health, or any other advice. This is an experimental tool. And you're like, well, wait a minute. It looks like it has encyclopedic knowledge of all things, and yet it's really simple when you start playing with these to get mistakes back. And I was just sharing with Representative Moss, I just put in a simple question into Bard, who are the leaders of the Utah legislature? And it got, first of all, it came up with Governor Cox, which was kind of weird because he's not in the legislature. But then it came up with, it got the majority leader of the Senate and the House, right? But for the minority leaders, it just completely made up people. In fact, they weren't even real people. And one of the pictures that put in was a picture of Bill Clinton. And I was like, well, so way off, like a human, with just a simple inspection by a real human, it was obviously way off in the model, but it looks so encyclopedic and true. And so one of the things that we need to do from, and I'm not sure if it's a policy, but from a use case perspective, is we need to make sure that we don't go out and use this tool, as amazing as it is, without a real human taking a look at something. And for example, if you're going to put out a document or a statement, a real human needs to read that before it goes out and be accountable. And so things like transparency and accountability become really major issues in this space. If I generate something with artificial intelligence and I say publish it, first of all, I need to take accountability as the human for whatever I put out. And then second of all, it kind of raises some concerns. What is if I generate a piece of music or a piece of art or a written word using generative AI, who owns the copyright to that? I think those laws are not quite clear for us yet. And so it creates a lot of maybe potential issues that we as a society need to resolve.
I'll say just two things on that, because I hear this quite a lot. I think the inaccuracies go away with trillions of dollars of investment, the smartest minds in the world. I think that counter argument of those kinds of mistakes is going to go away, or it's going to be such a small percentage that in the coming year, that's going to be less and less and less. So I would say count on that. And so that makes it even more of a reliable tool to use, which leads to my second thought around your initial question. I had two reactions to this when I started using it last year. My first one is this is probably the single greatest innovation that I've seen in my lifetime, including the internet, which I'm also old enough to remember AOL diskettes and things like that. And the second was, holy crap, this is the greatest cheating tool I've ever seen in my life. And cheating, not just at a collegiate level, but cheating in life. And so that's a real challenge. And the second is the ability to make good people, bad people more easily. So if you want to do bad things on the internet, a lot of times you have to have technical skill to do it. And that was enough of a barrier just to stop people, right? But now the barrier is so low to do things that maybe you shouldn't, or try things that maybe you shouldn't, that it's going to entice and even create. Now, the flip side of that is more good people doing good things, but that makes me nervous that the entry point for deep fakes and things like that is the bar has become much lower to be able to do those kinds of things.
On the education side, so these generative models come from generative linguistics, right? And so that's it all stems from that. And there's a whole body of research about how language develops, how narrative develops. There's a whole body of research around generative learning, right? And the outcomes of generative learning are how do you create meaning? How do you actually create products? How do you create value? How do you do things in the world? So not all professors and all teachers are as gifted as Alex. So it makes me a little nervous that a lot of the generative learning is going to take place inside of the machine and not inside of the student. That's probably my biggest concern, because all of a sudden, as a student, you don't see all the steps that got to an answer, and you're not actually having to create and generate meaning, generate understanding, generate an ability to make sense. You can, and you can do it really well if you do it right. But my concern is just across the board that machines are going to become a lot smarter and people are going to become a lot stupider.
I would agree with what you said. And I don't even know my mother's phone number anymore, right? Like there's like going to be this balance, I think, going forward, where there's going to be a new level of acceptance around what we need to know, right? Or even if there's an emergency, I still don't have her number memorized. And we've all generally as a society come to accept that. And with that, there are some major risks. I mean, this panel knows I'm kind of a risk alert. But one of the ones that actually recently came up that was really interesting for me is the risk of the human interaction with AI, not AI itself. And what I mean by that, my company deployed a prototype that's an AGI prototype. And just to give you some insight, we store all of the inputs for our learning. So what are you putting into this thing? And what in there, from a privacy standpoint, might a company be throwing their whole database into some AI with people's phone numbers, information, right? Things that even legally, maybe they didn't know it was storing that information. And then who knows who the actor is on the other end. There are over 200,000 deployments, LLMs, different branches off of current learning language models to date. Tens of millions of those are being downloaded. Tens of millions. This isn't like some light project that's happening. So there's multiples of these being deployed. Tons of companies experimenting with them, and they're happening on private servers. So from a government standpoint, there's probably a large level of education that we've got to do with our different agencies. Like, hey, this is what is okay to put in something like this. This is what's not. And I heard some comments on this side where there's these massive disclosures, right? And it even says, you get on ChatGPT, one of the first things it says, it's like, don't put anything in here that's personal. We're keeping this information. But how many of us are ignoring that? Or how many of these LLMs and like these different models that we're interacting with don't even give us those disclosures?
Well, and just building on your first point and your point too, Barclay, is just this idea that we've sort of ceded a lot of our ability to do stuff because someone's doing it for us. I mean, even now with Google, there's always an answer. So there's never a sense for somebody that they have to remain in uncertainty and think about something, and figure it out for themselves, right? And so that's going to be obviously accelerated dramatically. But back on the data privacy point, and I think that would be an interesting last life gig for Bill Clinton. Maybe it comes back here. What do you think? But I think, what kind of makes me very nervous on the data privacy side and the data usage side. So whatever they're collecting about us, and then how are they using it? We've already seen that companies, this sort of surveillance capitalist model of way of doing business that has essentially gone unfettered because all of us have the government and society has not checked it. I think we're only now sort of waking up to what that is and how we have ceded a lot of our autonomy because we've allowed all that data to be collected. Now with AI, that the ability to operationalize that is, in my mind, just way, way better. And so that can give an unprecedented amount of power to either, bad actor governments or even good actor governments, as well as companies. And I think because our society waited so long to kind of start to get our arms around how big data was being collected and used to be monetized or to be controlling, in the case of China and others, it's hard for us now because all those precedents have already been set. All those things and business models of how you make money, which is collecting data and using it, right? Instead of having somebody pay for a service.
Similar to the privacy space, we're seeing states having to lead out of the privacy space because it's going to move so slow at the federal level. Obviously, this stuff needs to be dealt with more globally or federally because the interstate commerce or international type commerce implications. But I think there is a role for states to lead out and deal with this stuff because one, we can set a good model. And I think states like Utah are primed to deal with this type of stuff. We have consumer data privacy laws. We have the technical force and the technical expertise and the entrepreneurship here in Utah to deal with these things and kind of set these types of models that then become ubiquitous. And so I think it is relevant to talk about this stuff, even though historically it's been at a more federal level.
And maybe let's jump into that because we do want to leave some time at the end for question and answer. But there is a lot of discussion. We've got numerous legislative committees that are looking at this. Folks at the executive branch are doing a lot of work around this. UEOC, the governor's Unified Economic Commission, is also looking at this. A lot of people are looking at this. We've got this working group that's helping really kind of be on the front end of driving some of these policy ideas. How do we balance that? Utah has always been a leader. We're an innovator. We embrace technology. At the same time, we see some of these risks we've just talked about. What does that look like? And again, I will say, we're not to a point where we're saying, here's what we're going to do, but we're just starting to talk about what are some of the ways that the state can play a role and what can we start to look at. And maybe Utah could lead the way in setting some of these policies in place and other states could follow. But give me some thoughts around that.
Yeah, I immediately think of investing, right? Just as a business owner, naturally. And as a state, we invest in different ways. And I think one of the greatest ways we could invest in our future as a state is to actually put our money in AI, probably into our education system, probably into our different agencies. And I think if there was a dollar amount or some capital contribution or even time contribution by each department, the return would be phenomenal. That's probably the one thing I've seen around AI that's consistent in every industry, regardless of where it's being practiced, is people come back and they go, there's a real ROI here. And it happens quick. It happens so fast. And I actually think most companies are underestimating what the ROI is going to be. They're projecting 3-year ROIs, and dropping a third of their staff and getting, twice the productivity out of their developers. And the reality is, I think in 3 years, it'll be more than that. So as a state, it's like, I think we get to act pretty soon on this. However we invest, whether it's capital or time in agencies and definitely in our education space.
Just to piggyback off what Matt said, there are some massive opportunities opening in the education space for educating workers for this new AI first economy or AI driven economy, where you could be thinking about college programs that involve, similar to what you're doing, involve prompt engineering, that involve using AI, that build people into the new AI powered economy, or into workers for that new AI powered economy. Similarly, we're also in the middle of, right now, we're seeing one of the biggest reshorings of chip manufacturing. And that's kind of one of the big dirty secrets about this AI is it is a power hungry enterprise. It uses a lot of very high power, very specific chips. That's a place where Utah can be an innovator. We already have TI here. We can think about how do we build programs, how do we build the investments to bring more chip manufacturing, more data center hosting to the state.
I hear a lot, in education, just twice here, that we need to be teaching our students and preparing them and stuff. And since there's legislators and others here, I'll say it's extraordinarily difficult to get new courses approved at the collegiate level. There's just so much red tape there. And so if there was a way to make it easier to let colleges and universities create what I think should be general education courses. I could say that's where it's difficult. Electives, things like that, much easier, that are required courses for students. I think we're doing a disservice if we don't do that. We're not preparing them for when they leave and things like that. So I think that would be one way from a policy perspective as a state, when we're talking about ways to make that easier, even consider making that required is one. The second, and I'm a broken record on this, but I think we need to rank order in this state, stakeholders and companies and industries and citizens from the most affected to the least affected, because the answer and solution is different of what we can do based on who we're talking about. And there's some that are going to be dramatically disrupted and affected already, and they just don't know it, or in the near future. And so we should be focusing resources on that, I think.
Just to add there, I'll get you, Barclay. So Alex is also on there, the working group just specifically around AI and workforce. And this is one of the questions they're trying to see is some of these current majors are going to be very disruptive even in the next year. How do we get out in front of that? How do we get the information to them? And then looking longer term, how do we speed up that process? So I know that group's looking at that pretty in depth.
Yeah, that's right. It's a really important issue.
Yeah, I mean, to add on to that, so at the University of Utah, when I was there, we created certificates in entrepreneurship, certificates in digital skills, those kinds of things. I would love to see the state actually, in the point and what you're doing out there, create a set of certificates that don't lead to graduation or credit, but you can quickly turn on. And so any university student or non-matriculated student could go and pick up those skills really quickly. I think we could do that so easily as a state. We could provide so much available kind of certificates for these young people. I think that would be just an incredible investment from the state's perspective.
Like, what about regulatory? I mean, we've talked a little bit about that. Are there things that the state can do in terms of, the adoption and creation of AI? Is there anything the state can play a role in?
My line of thinking is we do need more comprehensive privacy legislation. We have to align and in some type of single act, build on the foundation that Moss and Cullimore have helped build around consumer privacy and other privacy acts, but let everybody know in a more comprehensive bill of what are the parameters and the rules of the game. And especially for private companies and government, we are so intertwined in terms of we get our services, we process our data with these companies. We're going to be using Utah startup AI companies' models and their services. So if we have comprehensive privacy legislation that lays out how you do privacy, one, they'll know how to build their services to be compliant, but then the public just knows, here's how I access privacy. It doesn't matter if it's a government or if it's a private entity, this is what privacy is, and here's how to protect it.
Going back to the deepfake type of things, one of the things that we need to address with AI technology is the verifiability of data, or verifiability of images, or verifiability of records, or anything like that. And so we've done a lot of work in this state in the blockchain space, and whether it's blockchain or some other, maybe AI comes up with some other way to verify the data, but there is going to be some interplay there. And I think that's one thing that it would be important for the state to do, is set up whatever the parameters are of the structure so that we can verify the authenticity of whatever data it is that we're looking at.
Love the verifiable data credential, verifiable digital credentials reference. Thank you. One comment I want to make is, so as CIO for the state, I have a very practical problem, right? Which is that we have across the state government, some 23,000 different employees, and people are using this now. And so we need to find a way as the state government to, I don't want to say, come out and say, squash it and say, don't use it, because there's tremendous potential for productivity, et cetera. So the strategy we're trying to do is we want to try to channel the use of it into a way that is secure, private, ensuring that we don't have people putting personally identifiable information or PHI or any proprietary information, making sure we have a human look at output before it goes out anyway. So I want to say this because I think it's important. The landscape here is shifting very quickly. And so what we talk about today, well, a month from now, there might be something else that has popped out. And so, but the strategy we're trying to do is we want to put in place a sandbox. We use that term, or another word for it is a private environment or an enterprise solution. And so the idea is that our cybersecurity team can scan and confirm that there's no PII going into the model. We can maybe use artificial intelligence tools to make sure that we're not breaching protocols of privacy and security with our state government. So we're rushing to try to find a safe way to use this technology to encourage its use, in a way that's responsible, private, secure, transparent, et cetera, et cetera.
So I keep thinking of the word agility and speed, because, even going back to education and this kind of idea of micro-credentialing, I mean, that's going to be the name of the game, right? Universities have not been used to having to quickly build up new programs, right? Because things weren't changing as fast. Now they're changing so fast that we have to be able to kind of ingrain that in our culture, that you have to keep reskilling, upskilling constantly in your life. But regulation is the same way. In this job, I've thought a lot about regulation. And of course, people used to talk about reasonable and reliable is what you wanted. What you really need is relevant. And it's hard to do that, because what happens is you pass a law, you're like, okay, we're done. And then things change like that. And every time you have this irrelevant regulation that is not caught up to what it needs to be, you have either harm or you have economic waste, or both. And so figuring out how we structurally create that agility, I think, we've talked a lot about the sandbox idea amongst this group, a regulatory sandbox. And I think we're still trying to kind of come to grips with that, what that would look like. I think that does allow for some more agility, because we can look at things and we can make changes as we're observing, and it's top of mind. But I think that is one of the big challenges here.
Well, I think an opportunity on the positive side around regulation is you have so much data that sits in for healthcare, for example, that can't be shared between counties, whether it's the cost data on it or the clinical data, right? So you have all this data in all these silos in education, in healthcare, in economic development. And now with these generative models, you can actually create synthetic data sets, right, that have no PII, but maintain the statistical properties of the data, where you can go and train at a very rigorous level and gain new insights about how to understand a population, whether it's health, education, economic. And my concern is that we lock down all those silos, and we lock it down. We already have it locked down, but with our new, the regulation could either lock it down so that no synthetic data could be generated, because these algorithms can get so powerful when you share and pool data across counties or districts or these things might. So my concern is that we have all of this valuable information that's so useful for the public good that can maintain privacy, but simultaneously help us understand how to improve population health, how to improve population education, how to improve the economy. Like, I think we could set up in Utah a legislative structure that could do that in such a positive way, that it would free that up in a way that would become very valuable for society.
I went to a conference 2 weeks ago, and we had a number of other states there, leadership of other states, and everybody's talking about it. Everybody's trying to get their arms around it, and it kind of hit me. One of the unique things that Utah has in terms of approaching this subject is exactly what you see up here today. You've got higher education, you've got Senate and House. We did have Dean, nobody couldn't make it. We've got connections there, very close connection with the executive branch, and we all work together very well. And this is something that's moving so fast. There's so many variables, and I think Utah is really in a pretty prime position if we can come up with the right mix of being innovative while also protecting, our privacy and civil liberties. But Utah could probably be a leader just in the fact we actually get along and like each other. And that's a unique thing when I go to other states, but that's not always the case. So any other kind of final things on this end before we open it up to questions? Any other final comments anybody has?
I'd love to touch on that one. So I got asked to speak in front of a private group of CEOs in Silicon Valley 2 weeks ago. They brought me in with their CTOs to get updated on AI. And I think this is the question everyone's asking is I'm hearing about companies and industries or groups that are leveraging it, but how does it actually apply to me? And how do I actually become an AI company versus one that just has a simple next, right? I mean, we're seeing so much of that being leveraged right now. Immediately, I would say, if you've got a CTO or a developer, GitHub is your place. Like that's your home. There's a new community called Hugging Face. And if you haven't heard of it, you've got to get on Hugging Face. Like that is the place where everything from a developmental standpoint, your CTO, whoever your technology officer is, that's where they need to be going. Because that's where all this open source information is happening. And there's really nothing that you can't do that's not already discussed in there, and it's completely free.
Expertise helps. So definitely there are a lot of folks, not just myself, but there are a lot of folks in this space who have been really exploring generative AI from a consulting professional services background. So that can help a lot with implementation because there are a lot of considerations that you need some experience behind. Because speaking from, taking it back to the regulatory side, I think what we're thinking about in terms of this regulatory working group as well is how do we build kind of those clear guardrails and those clear rules of the road for companies like yours looking to adopt AI. How do they do it in a way that is compliant, efficient, respects privacy, but also gives you max space to innovate?
I'd love to touch one part of that, which is in the decision-making process. So if you are engaging with the government to get government services and a decision is made and you have a right to recourse, you may have a right to appeal in the court or appeal to another authority. So if AI is used to make a decision or determination and you don't know how that decision is made or the path taken to make that decision, how do you appeal that? How do you know where there may have been an issue in that? If AI is used to determine, can you get a building permit? This is back in Ivory Oaks. If it's used to determine, can you get a permit? Is it used to determine, whether you can or cannot get government services? You have to know how the decision was made. And that's I think a different part of AI of how are you going to build it to track what was used to make a decision so you can determine was that accurate or not. But then you have the other concept of verifiability of what came out of it. And actually, I think that's a very complex question that needs to be discussed in depth of what that verifiability is and who actually made that or who put the prompt into the AI. And this government employee made a request for some type of determination from AI. It says this person made it. They digitally sign they've made it, and then AI issues their determination, and that it's issued that determination. But there's a new chain of authority that you have to track of who's doing what in that actual model. So that's only, I think, part of what you're getting at. But I think we're just at the start of trying to discuss the complexity there, so people can still then essentially protect their rights. If something negative happens against them, that they should have recourse for.
It's challenging because you're asking people to potentially train others how to end their job in some ways. So you have to start from just where you have to convince, and this is difficult for anybody, education or otherwise, to say, hey, you may be training your replacement. And so you have to kind of check that at the door and say, I'm an educator. First, my responsibility is to educate. And that might mean that they need me less. The ways that I'm doing it that don't apply to all disciplines, but I think they do to a lot of them, you kind of have to start with this thought, I think, that their beginning point is much higher. And so the learning outcomes I'm seeing is they started here at the beginning of the semester and they ended here. And now I'm seeing them start here and end here. That's a great thing, but I have to change my expectations. So one of the things I've said for the last 7 years as a professor that kind of makes some people uncomfortable is I said, look, this isn't an English course, but it's impossible to write well and be stupid. And so unfortunately, that is no longer true. And so that bar just had to get raised. And so, like I said, my 12-year-old with K-12, you have to have educators that I think fully embrace it and want to learn it and want to know it and want to use it to augment their teaching and feel great about it and totally change their perspective that this is something we need to stop and fight and block and turn away from, knowing that you're going to have to up your game. You're going to have to add value in new ways. So you're going to have to change. You're going to have to learn. So it starts with that. It's kind of a mind shift because, I'm a lifelong entrepreneur that happens to be an educator as well. And so it's hard. I don't know the answer. It's hard to get them to think about that because it attracts people that are kind of stereotypically not as comfortable with change, that industry. It kind of attracts people that want conservative, stable, kind of jobs doing the same thing for 30 years, which aren't a bad thing, but it doesn't lend itself to disrupting that comfort that they seek. So, you can require it in some ways, the way that I do in my class, we talked to earlier. I make them use it, number one, but they have to show me how they're using it. They screenshot, these are the questions that I asked. These are the answers that I got. Here's my version of it. And then I actually make them present it without notes, because the highest level of learning is I can teach you. And so I know that they've got it. And the learning outcomes in the classroom are remarkable. The level that they're leading my class becomes that full educational embracing and the use of new tools. But it's scary, it's hard, it's a tectonic shift for education. I don't know the answer, but the easiest thing that I can say is this willingness to be open-minded, that your job is going to change dramatically and may even go away. And that's a scary thing for educators to accept.
I think an answer to that question, though, if you take it back, it varies depending on whether we're talking like K through 6, secondary education, or even higher education, right? Because I think what we're scared about, and somebody touched on this earlier, is losing the ability to critically think, losing the ability to actually learn for yourself. So I think we need to have real deep discussions about when do we start implementing this, because it is going to change our economy. It is going to change what we do. But I think we need to make a conscious effort or decision of when we start implementing that into our kids' lives, because if they're not learning how to read, if they're not learning how to critically think and using logic skills in elementary school, they're never going to get that once they tap into these tools. So I think that's problematic for me. I've got a 5th grade son that told me on, at 10 o'clock at night that he had a project due the next day, or on a particular state on Hawaii. And so I asked ChatGPT, give me 7 interesting facts about Hawaii that would be appropriate for a 5th grade project. And then I refined it more. I said, turn those into 1 sentence each. And I said, make it bite-sized for a poster. And it did all that, And so, and I was in a crunch, so I was justified.
Yeah. I love it.
But that's not something that my 5th grader should be doing, right? Yeah. Like he needs to learn to think, he needs to learn to research, and needs to understand the steps that it took to actually get there. And so we need to have those discussions about what's appropriate for elementary school.
I have a 10 and 12-year-old, and we're talking about critical thinking. Like, we're going to lose this critical thinking ability with AI. And I just completely disagree. My 10 and 12-year-olds are coding video games, and they are thrilled about it. They are going into AI and they're asking the AI, "Well, make the little frog do this," and then they're going in and it doesn't quite work, and now they're like, "Well, I want it to work." And that's critical thinking. I think, like everyone said, we just have to shift how we're going to educate and apply the critical thinking, allow these kids to just fully embrace AI. And then the critical thinking will be there. We'll just be doing it differently, and it may be really engaging. It might for my kids, it's fun, right? They love it.
I think also just determining as we go through this process, determining what they need to learn first before they start automating it.
Yeah.
And then, and some of it, I think we probably don't have to anymore, right? But some of it we still do. So I think about it like a calculator, right? You still have to learn arithmetic or the basic concepts, then you can implement it on a calculator. And when I went through my calculus class in high school, I had to understand what was going on with integrals and derivatives conceptually, and then I could do it, right? And I think so. I think for us as educators, I'm not as me an educator, but society, figuring out what is useful to learn by hand, so to speak, to be able to capture that, and what is actually not anymore. Right? It's not a waste of it. It's a waste of our brain power.
I think we're trying to look at it holistically, right? And so we've divided up into subgroups to look at that, look at opportunities, look at appropriate regulations, look at, Matt talked about having government agencies, tap into AI to find efficiencies within government. We've heard a lot about regulation, and then I think there's going to be a lot of interplay too, right? So I think some of the stuff we're looking at right away is some sort of regulatory sandbox or something that we've heard about. We've got to talk about how to expand the data privacy rights that we have right now. The Consumer Data Privacy Act is specific and directed to private enterprise. We also have some guardrails that we put on government, but that needs to be more expansive now and without stifling innovation. So those are a couple of my thoughts.
One other thought I know that we had talked about is one of the laws that we enforce within the Department of Commerce is the Consumer Sales Practices Act. Thank you, CSPA. And so this is really about deceptive practices, right? And so if a consumer experiences a deceptive practice from a business, they can come and they can call us and we can investigate. And this applies all over the place. So for instance, that law applies in prosecuting opioid manufacturers or distributors, right? Because they were maybe deceptive in how they were distributing these and their messaging. So just as an example. But now with deep fakes, how do we integrate that kind of thing within that law? So do we make it worse to be able to use AI? And so that it becomes much more of a deterrent if you're using AI to deceive or not, or if it just follows the general you deceived, regardless of whether it was through AI or not. So I think we have to really think about that law. And that's one thing that I'm thinking about.
For businesses and we spend this is what we do every day, 24/7, right? We're thinking about this, is that we understand the guardrails, but then we're also thoughtful. So we have this protection level, but that we also don't over-regulate, right? So that's my concern, is that things that we wouldn't have typically regulated, we might throw an AI label and say, you can't do it anymore. So I'm at this point to the IB Home example, right? Like our team's doing a lot of work around assets and markets. And there's a lot you can do with predictive algorithms around risk assessments, around asset classes, right? And what we're able to see at our forward predictive level going out is quite frankly astonishing. And my fear with my team is that we currently aren't regulated on that, because we can look at stocks, we can look at land, and we're able to, with timeline GANs and all kinds of things, see a great deal of what's going to be coming. And my concern is that all of a sudden, things that were never regulated before, all of a sudden, because it's Gen AI that's doing this risk assessment, whether if these asset classes or markets, you can't do it anymore. That's part of my nervousness, right? Because our team, we're literally working 24/7 on figuring this stuff out. And right now, it's fine to do it. But we're just worried that one day, these things that are really helpful for businesses, we can't do anymore, right? I don't think that'll happen, but it's partially what we're thinking about when we're making decisions about investments. Like if we get really good at this, and someday people that's going to slap us down and say you can't do this anymore.
I think that the boards, local boards and state boards, do need to be thinking about it. I don't know. Again, I don't know if they're usually the ones who are on the cutting edge of innovation. I do know that a lot of teachers are using it right now. My wife's a teacher and she loves ChatGPT. Helps her develop. She can use letters and use it for some visuals and things. There's ways that they're already using it, but I think they definitely are going to need, and I think Alex has said this pretty well, they're going to need support. They're going to need to understand better what the opportunities are, and then also the safety things around that, what can and can't we use those for. But really, I think the State Board of Education could be a leader in that. And I know there's some folks on the board that are pretty technology focused. And so that group could help. But then local boards, I think we're going to need to look at that even at a legislative level. How do we get those resources out there to make sure that we're using it to the fullest advantage that I think it has? I don't know if anybody want to add to that.
I would like to see technology companies step into the breach and provide, ChatGPT for kids. You can sort of imagine a technical solution that is safe and age appropriate and designed to be used by younger people. Haven't seen it yet, but I can imagine that happening.
I hope we get to that point sooner rather than later, because again, like the data privacy issue, we kind of allowed a lot of these technology companies to develop and give kids access in unfettered ways that have really caused harm. Our agency is tasked with implementing the new social media laws, trying to protect minors from some of the harms of that. So we need to be thinking about that same concept when it comes to ChatGPT and other LLMs.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are out of time. I just wanted to, again, thank this panel. I think they've been amazing. I also want to add, it's great for them to be here. We talked about this. And in fact, the working group's larger than this. But one of the things that they said is we need to bring the public along, right? We're having all these conversations. We're still trying to work through what is this going to look like. This is our way of trying to engage the public and get feedback as we're thinking about these things. But if we could give a round of applause to this panel for their time and all the great feedback.